Hello everybody, welcome to our first ever live stream. We are currently live streaming to YouTube today for our In Conversation. I'm Jane Commane from Nine Arches Press, and I'm delighted to be here today talking with Helen Dewbery. Helen Dewbery, can you hear me?
I can, yes. Yes, everything's right. Hi everybody.
Hi Helen, welcome to our lunchtime In Conversation session. This is the first one we've done, so thank you for being our inaugural guest for this session. I'm really looking forward to having a talk with you about poetry film. First of all, Helen, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? So you make film, you're a filmmaker, you also specialise particularly in making films of poetry or poem films. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and perhaps how you came to be involved with that?
Yeah, well, it started in New York. I think about 11 years ago, Chaucer, Cameron and myself were in New York taking holiday snaps, really, for want of a better word. And then on the way home, that awful nighttime flight on the way home from New York, Chaucer wrote a poem. And I was looking through some of the images that I'd taken and decided just to put them both together. And so that became our first film, and became quite addicted to it after that. So we worked together a lot on putting poetry film together. Prior to that, I've always, as long as I can remember, had a camera in my hand. And as cameras developed and phones developed the ability to video, it seemed a kind of natural progression to do that. So that's a bit about how we came to be where we are now. There's a great international community as well that we're really pleased to be a part of, and it's led to some amazing experiences traveling to different places and meeting people.
That's really interesting in terms of how it's been part of community, and I think that's something that we're all finding at the moment in terms of how film is enabling us to be online, to be talking to each other, to be sharing our work in different ways as writers and as poets. And I know you've been very busy recently as well with Poetry Film Live, your website. You've been doing some work to update that during lockdown. Could you give us an update really with what you've been up to?
Yeah, so Poetry Film Live is a UK-based online magazine, and we publish poetry film and poetry film-related essays and reviews, and it's been going for a few years now. We've now added, we're accepting submissions of videos and sound recordings of poetry being read or performed. And we've recently added the strapline, A New Way with Poetry. So it's now Poetry Film Live, A New Way with Poetry. And we made those changes because we recognise that the future of poetry gatherings and open mics and other events is so uncertain, not only in the short term, but also in the longer term. We just don't know what will happen. So that's why we're including performances and reading of poetry, so that there's a new channel for poets to share their work in person, as it were. And we've also made it the platform for our online poetry film training. And again, that came about because of the recent lockdown. In April, we were invited to give an introductory talk to a group in Cheltenham, but it became clear that face-to-face meetings wouldn't happen. So we took the opportunity to run a poetry film workshop online. 35 poets signed up to the course. And it was run on Facebook units. And because we'd always intended to have an online course at some point, now it seemed the right time to do that. It was kind of now or we're never going to do it. So we went ahead and put it online on Poetry Film Live. And so I think over the last weeks, we've been looking at how we'll respond to change. And as you know, there's been a fair bit recently about that it would be a shame if poetry just goes back to physical readings and all the online stuff just stops. And certainly if we've learned anything during lockdown, surely it must be about access. And so to pick up on that going forward, we shouldn't let go of that issue. So access for people living with disability, carers, people on low income, access for anyone where attending events isn't possible or easy. And I think, like other organisations, we can make changes if we have that purpose to do so. And also knowing that it just won't happen. There's no magic formula to it. There's plenty of stuff to learn, from live casting to Facebook, from Zoom, from learning new software, creating new safeguards. And I've been thinking about how we can create opportunities for new people to access online events and become part of the poetry community. So we can all make those changes, and that's what we've tried to do at Poetry Film Live.
It's really exciting to hear of all those things you've been working on, Helen, and really extraordinary as well, the speed at which a lot of this has happened. So you've been ahead of the game in lots of ways, I think, in terms of developing ways in which poetry can meet audiences, but certainly I think there's been huge sea change, and let's hope that the positives that come out of this are that we have greater events available online. Like you say, it opens up huge opportunity for audiences to join us. And I think it's absolutely amazing to be doing events where you have people attending from all over the world as well. What a fundamentally brilliant thing to be able to do, that technology is enabling us to do. And I hope that more organisations, like you say, do continue with that. So could I just ask as well, something that interests me, so the difference between a poem film and a poetry film, or a film poem. So these are all phrases that get used when we talk about different types of those, but I'm conscious there's a quite clear difference between some of them. So could you explain a little bit more about those terms and what they mean?
Yeah, well, I think those terms are broadly the same thing in lots of ways. A combination of poetry, film and sound, where the elements merge and sometimes create new meanings and enhanced layers. But the actual different definition or terminology tends to come from the person that invented it. So William Wheese in 1970s, I think it was, came up with the term, and I'm going to get that wrong. I think it was poetry film hyphenated, to recognise the combination of the close connection between the two. So in some ways, I don't think the terminology, whether we call it film poem, video poem, poetry film, matters particularly. And I think in different parts of the world, different phrases are used. So in Germany and the UK, poetry film is often used. In the States, they would not talk so much about film, but video. So you can get very caught up in these different phrases, and I think they're generally meaning the same thing. What I am drawn to in what I tend to call poetry film now is that the different types of poetry film, and I think there's a type that's a literary form. So a form of poetry that's not just visual, that's visual, not just textual. And where the focus is on poetry in the sense of language, voice and metre, rather than the stronger visual elements and visual effects, and where the words rather than the sound create the emotion and atmosphere. And then I think it's those qualities that can root a type of poetry film in the history of poetry, and a history that, as we know, is continually adapted to new technologies. So for me, it can be another form of poetry.
I love that idea as well about it being another form of poetry. And just to urge anyone watching this, if you've enjoyed listening to this in conversation today, not only can you have a look on Poetry Live at Helen's really useful website, which has lots of tips and films as well about making your own poetry films, as well as information about the work that Poetry Film Live have been doing. But if you want to have a look at our YouTube channel, you'll see lots of poetry films that Helen's been making for us over a period of about 2 years. So we've got videos that accompany single poems by Teresa Lola, by Josephine Corcoran, Deborah Ulmer, David Clarke, Julia Webb, Susanna Evans, all different kinds of interpretations of how those poems work, and really beautiful, very intricate often in terms of how they interpret them. Each one of them very different as well. Each one has a really characteristic style, which I really enjoy about the poem films. So thank you, Helen, for giving us a little bit more of an insight into that world. And I'm hoping that watching this will be, for some writers, an illuminating moment of thinking, okay, what can I do with my poems? How could I maybe work to make some film poems, some film poetry, some poem films, however they want to think about it, of my own work, which may simply just involve sitting, talking like we are now to our cameras and our computers, to make some short films of us just reading our poems so that we can connect with audiences. Or we may be tempted to venture a little bit further into thinking about making visual responses to the poems that go with the poem and become a sort of film poem or poem film to go online. What would be your top tips, Helen? Because sometimes the technology can seem quite daunting, or the processes involved might seem quite daunting. But the great thing is so many of us just basically have one of these to hand and can kind of use that to do all different kinds of things with. So what would your advice be to anyone looking to get started?
Well, I think there's the technical aspect, and then there's the kind of imagining the whole process to it. So I think from the imagining the process, I like to encourage poets to imagine poetry film as a form of poetry, but whereby you're organising the elements of your poem on the screen, using images and sound to create structure. And then making a poetry film becomes much like making a poem. So then you look at having an original idea, an imaginative vocabulary, visual and text, avoiding cliches, redundancies and being too literal, playing between the images, the text and the sound, and having clear, audible and visual meters. So, and often using the poet's voice to enhance this, or using text on a screen. So I think that's how it can be approached in a sort of a imaginative idea. So you're not left with thinking that was a brilliant film, but actually I could have just read the poem on a page. So it's something extra that the visuals and the sound bring. But of course, to learn the technicals and to learn more about the process of what makes a good poetry film, then join the online training. I would encourage people to do that. And it's for all poets who've ever wondered what poetry film is and thought, wouldn't it be great to make one? And we go through step by step how you can create poetry films on your smartphone. So you don't need a lot of or any specialist equipment. And we show you how to get started with just your phone. But we also include some advanced tutorials as well, so that people have the tools to develop the practice and begin to think critically about poetry film. And we also include one-to-one feedback on poetry films that are made during the course. I think that's with poetry film. I think also with recording yourself reading, that's another skill that doesn't necessarily come naturally. So I don't know if people have seen the recent great video with Liz Berry reading, is it Republic of Motherhood? Is that the name of the poem? I think it is, where she's mainly in a kitchen, but also the camera goes out into the street. It's creative and imaginative and brilliant film of somebody reading and performing a poem, bringing aspects of theatre and performance. So there's that type of reading to camera and filming, and there's also more what you might call straightforward reading to a camera phone, like the Nine Arches reads that have been really great to watch and be involved in. Then it's about the poet's engagement with the poem and the camera. So it's not just picking up a book and reading, but it's engaging with it in the same way that you might engage with an audience. If you're performing live, you actually engage with the camera. And again, I think we've all noticed that videoing or reading to camera, it requires a new set of skills. And so to help with that, on Poetry Film Live, we commissioned 2 videos, one with Kevin Brooke about how to make voice recordings from home better. And that's got some really useful tips about using microphones, making your room less echoey with using duvet and cushions. So that's got some really useful tips about recording a voice. And then another video we commissioned with Dominic Weston was about filming yourself reading a poem from a smartphone. And that's all about where to put the phone, if you need to read the poem while you're recording, where to place the poem, lighting, what's in the background, that sort of thing. So that's another really important thing.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's been really, really interesting to hear you talk about all of the projects that you've been involved in. Can you just remind us where we can find Poetry Film Live online?
Yes, it's at www.poetryfilmlive.com. And we're open at the moment for submissions of poetry films and voice recordings and video recordings of poets reading their work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Helen. We've come to the end of our